So everybody, here I have the iPhone 13 Pro Max and the iPhone 14 Pro Max, or actually which one is which, because it's so hard to tell with these two side by side when they have pretty much the same camera bump, the same case, and the only difference, or at least the only visual difference, is that dynamic island. So in this video, what I want to do is talk about and compare the iPhone 13 Pro Max to the 14 Pro Max and see if it's a worthy upgrade if you are coming from the 13 Pro Max, and if the 14 Pro Max 6 months later is still a good buy overall. So without further ado, let's compare these two behemoths, and for a short synopsis, for the most part, they are pretty identical, but let's get right into this video. So let's quickly go over the design of the iPhone 14 Pro Max versus the iPhone 13 Pro Max, and this is going to be pretty relevant for the Pro models as well as just the regular 14 and 13 comparatively, but I like to go with the 14 and 13 Pro Max versions because those are the ones that I personally use. So from a design standpoint, these things are pretty much identical, and the best way to really test this out, aside from holding them side by side and actually feeling them in the hand, is to take a 13 Pro Max and put it in a 14 Pro Max case. And you'll realize that once you do that, it will still fit perfectly from a footprint and thickness standpoint. Yes, the camera bump is a little bit different, but it still fits inside of the camera bump. It just kind of looks a little bit weird. But from a footprint standpoint, from a thickness standpoint, even when you use one of the smaller and more form-fitting cases, it's still going to fit perfectly, which means from a design and in the feel and from a dimension standpoint, they stayed relatively exactly the same. I think there's a tiny bit of a difference in terms of weight. I think it's an extra 2 grams of heftiness on the 14 Pro Max, which we'll double check, but that is the only real difference from a physical standpoint in terms of the actual hardware and the design. You still have that stainless steel rail that it's very flat in design, which can stand up on its own, which the design standpoint, I actually like it. The new design language that was adopted with the iPhone 12 that went to the 13 and now to the 14 is actually one of my favorite iPhones, especially compared to what we had in the past from the 6 all the way to the iPhone XS and XS Max. So long story short, if you enjoy the design of the 13, then you're gonna love the design of the 14. There's no real difference aside from the different colorway, which went from the Pacific Blue or the Sierra Blue, I forget which one it was exactly, over to the deep purple. And then of course, from a hardware standpoint, the cameras and the camera bump is just a little bit larger from a footprint standpoint and a little bit thicker to fit that larger 48 megapixel camera sensor, which we're gonna touch on in a little bit. So the synopsis is, if you hold them side by side and you look at them, especially from the rear, where you can't see the dynamic island, and you're looking at maybe both space gray colors or both white colors, both silver colors, then you'll notice that they are pretty much exactly the same, everybody. And a quick little anecdote, and one of the best examples that I can give of how similar these phones are, I always rock Pitaka cases on my iPhones because they give me the best kind of bang for buck in terms of protection to thinness form factor, which I like my cases to be as thin as possible, still give me some extra MagSafe magnets in there, and also protect my iPhone from scuffs and scratches, and that's exactly what Pitaka MagEasy cases do. So I have a Pitaka case on the 13 Pro Max and a Pitaka case on the 14 Pro Max, and the other day I got a FaceTime. Both of those iPhones were on and they were signed into my iCloud, and then I ended up grabbing the 13 Pro Max just by accident, just because it was a little bit closer to me, and I grabbed it thinking it was the 14 Pro Max. And it wasn't until I was midway through my conversation that I realized that I held the 13 Pro Max and not the 14 Pro Max during that FaceTime. So that's to give you an example of a real world confusion or a real world situation where they are so similar that I grabbed the 13 Pro Max thinking it was a 14 Pro Max. So take that story as you will. So now, instead of talking about maybe the internals and the specs and all that good stuff, because, you know, these are powerful devices and they have some cool specs, but at the end of the day, it's how usable is this device? How much better or how much more efficiency or how much more, you know, quality of life am I receiving by upgrading year to year from a 13 Pro Max to a 14 Pro Max? And then let me tell you, in the internals, yes, we have the A16 Bionic on the 14 Pro Max and the A15 Bionic on the 13 Pro Max, but at the end of the day, it's all iOS, it's all iOS 16, it's all iPhones. The usability and the user experience overall is identical. I've seen no difference. They both rock that ProMotion display at 120 Hertz. They both have that great pixel density. Yes, the new 14 Pro Max has a peak brightness of 2000 nits on the display, but at the end of the day, I was never yearning for more brightness in direct sunlight. I believe the 13 Pro Max gets up to 1600 nits of brightness in direct sunlight, and then 2000 for peak brightness on the 14 Pro Max. And maybe you can tell in some instances that it's a little bit brighter, but it's very far in between. Even on like very, very sunny days where the glare is kind of crazy, I'm never like peeking or kind of squinting to see what's on my phone, which is something that I couldn't say maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago with those older iPhones. But like I said, from a usability standpoint, they're very similar, right? I use them both for iMessage, I use them both to watch YouTube videos, I use them both to scroll through Twitter, I use them both to film these A-roll cameras, I use them both to FaceTime, I use them both for video chatting, I use them both to play the same Retro Bowl game or Marvel Strike Force game. there's been no hiccups. And I thought even maybe from a gaming standpoint, I'd see a little bit more power, a little bit more fluidity with the games that I play, but they work exactly the same. No faster, no slower, no better experience. It's all the same exact thing at the end of the day. If anything, the notch on the 13 Pro Max gets in the way less than the actual dynamic island on the 14 Pro Max. So if you're happy with how usable your actual iPhone 13 Pro Max is and your experience with the software on iOS 16, then you're gonna have that same exact experience on the actual iPhone 14 Pro Max. The only thing you're doing is future-proofing yourself for maybe an extra year. So maybe the iPhone 13 is only gonna get iOS 19 and the iPhone 14 will get iOS 20, 3-4 years down the road. But today, iOS 16 runs identical on both of these phones overall. So now let's talk about the differences on paper on both of these devices, both from a hardware and a software standpoint. So first off, we gotta talk about that camera, right? The camera does give us the first ever 48 megapixel camera on an iPhone. Before that, we had a 12 megapixel camera dating all the way back to the iPhone 6. Yes, the sensor changed a little bit, but at the end of the day, they were all 12 megapixel sensors. So I'm gonna put some photos up right now to show you guys that from a snap and shoot situation. So if you pull out your phone, don't change any settings, have everything on auto, keep everything in that 1x optical zoom, you snap a quick picture of whatever you have, especially if you're in good lighting, the photos are very, very similar. Yes, on the iPhone 14 Pro Max, you do have the 48 megapixel camera, but it is binning down to 12 megapixels by default, because if you were taking 48 megapixel raw photos every single time, those are 50 to 200 to 250 megabyte photos that will immediately start to chew up at your storage. So if you have that baseline 128 gig iPhone and you take, let's say, 100 pictures, your storage is going to take a huge hit immediately. 100 pictures at 250 megabytes of storage, I think that's about 25 gigs with just images, whereas on my camera roll, I think I have 18,000 images, so that's just not going to work out for me. Now, there is a new feature that Apple's been touting as the way it processes images on the 14 and 14 Pro Max, and that's a new photonic engine and that new threshold and protocol. But at the end of the day, like I mentioned, if you have good sunlight, if you're taking pictures of landscapes, if you're taking pictures of subjects that are in good lighting, those snap and shoot images are going to be pretty much the same. Low light images are a little bit better, I would say, on the 14 Pro Max, but also at the end of the day, I would still be able to take a shareable photo with my 13 Pro Max in that low light situation. So the 2x optical zoom isn't really a fourth camera lens. Obviously, as you can see with the rear of the iPhone, you still have your 3 focal lengths or your 3 camera sensors. You have your ultra wide, which is that 0.5x optical zoom. You have your regular wide, which is your 1x zoom. And then you have your macro, which is that 3x optical zoom. But they're actually able to provide a 2x optical zoom, because what it's doing is then when you're going to that 2x zoom, it's actually unbinning itself, so going into that full 48 megapixel frame, but then zooming into the inner 12 megapixels, giving us a true 12 megapixel 2x optical zoom, which I think is a great way to actually make that selling point reality, and it does work well. So you can tell from a zoom picture, it does actually take some crispy photos. So if you digitally zoom on 13 Pro Max into the 2x zoom, and then you actually use the 2x optical length on the actual camera on the 14 Pro Max, those images on the 14 Pro Max do come out a little bit crispier because you're not just zooming into the digital crop, you're actually using an actual focal length, which does actually help out a decent amount. But overall, for most people that are just gonna grab their camera, pull it out, take a quick picture of their family, of their loved ones, something to remember, to have a memory of, as opposed to product photography where you actually make a living off of it, or you use it for videos on YouTube, or you do, Instagram or influencing as a full-time job where you need a good camera, then maybe those people will be able to take advantage of it. But for the everyday user, the camera on the 13 Pro Max is more than capable enough. And then to go quickly into video, honestly, video is still king on the iPhone, and it's no different on the 14 Pro Max. The 13 Pro Max is still plenty good on the video front. The only new service or feature that Apple included on the 14 Pro Max is the Action Cam. So instead of having to import a shaky image and then use a stabilizer in post, you can actually stabilize action footage in real time directly from the iPhone camera. That's something that I don't personally use because I do some product photography and product video stuff, and when I do need to go and actually stabilize the footage, I just do it in post, which is very easy in LumaFusion. But I do see some use cases where the action shot would be cool to show off as a little bit of a gimmick, or as this is really cool to have on the camera, but not many people will be using it on a day-to-day as a value-added feature for the camera itself. So that's what we got from a hardware standpoint on the camera side. And then also, Apple did introduce the SOS satellite connectivity on the iPhone 14s. So if you are somebody that's always in the wilderness, or you're out there diving hundreds of feet down into the water, or you're in situations where you just don't have normal cell coverage, which that is not me. I always am in situations where I have some sort of cell coverage. I'm not somebody that goes hiking miles into the wilderness. But if you are that person and you want to be able to send an SOS signal because something happened to you, then I do see that being a value-added feature, because it will save lives. And it already has, as you guys can see in some 9 to 5 posts, we've seen situations where SOS actually works as intended, and it does bring rescue in situations where there is no cell phone signal. So if you're somebody that is in those situations, the iPhone 14 is your only option at that point. But do keep in mind that it does work on the cheapest iPhone 14, and you don't need to get the Pro Max to get that SOS capability, as well as crash detection. So crash detection came to the iPhone 14s. It's exactly what it sounds like. If you do get into a car accident or motorcycle accident where there's a lot of G-forces involved, then the iPhone will start to send out a signal to 911 or your emergency services to make sure somebody's there to help you out overall. If those are features that are very important to you, then by all means, the 14 is the only one that can actually do that. The 13 does not have crash detection or that SOS capability. And now let's move over to the front of the iPhone, because the only other visual difference that you see between the 13 Pro Max and the 14 Pro Max is that dynamic island. And that dynamic island comes with a lot of controversy in my opinion. It's either you love it or you hate it. There isn't really an in-between. And I've been using it off and on for a while. I did have the iPhone 14 Pro Max for a few weeks in the beginning, and then I did get it a few weeks ago again recently. And my overall consensus is that it's a nice little add-on, right? It doesn't add anything from a function standpoint. It's all a form standpoint, right? Sometimes every now and then it will make you a little bit more efficient just by being able to glance at a time instead of having to scroll down on your control center. So it does give you a little bit of usability, and it's a very cute and awesome way to implement and a great proof of concept of how Apple is able to marry hardware and software so seamlessly. Like, don't get me wrong, it's a very cool and it's a very awesome engineering feat. But at the end of the day, it hasn't provided too much value to me, right? Yes, it's cool to be able to see the live Miami Heat score, the Miami Hurricane score during March Madness. Yes, it's cool to pull up Flighty and get some information at a glance. Yes, it's cool to have the timer up there, or maybe know that I'm recording a screen recording. Those are all things that are nice and tangible, I guess. But at the end of the day, all that stuff is still on the 13 Pro Max, right? If I'm screen recording, I get a little red dot on the top left corner. If I have the timer on, I can just scroll down to my control center or my notifications tab and get that as a live activity. Live activities still work, right? Widgets on the lock screen still work. Everything that the dynamic island gives you from a functionality standpoint is also brought on the 13 Pro Max. It's just how it looks and how you interact with it overall, because interacting with the dynamic island is very cool, but after a while you kind of forget that it's there. You forget that that's a part of the phone. It's not really a selling point anymore. And then when you go back to the 13 Pro Max, you don't really miss it. Like if I went from the 14 down to the 13, you're not going to miss the dynamic island because all the stuff is still accessible via the control center or the notification center or right there on top on the toolbar, whatever the case may be. And then also the notch is a little less intrusive than that dynamic island. And then the very last thing that I wanted to bring up is just how well the iPhone 13 Pro Max specifically has held up over time, because I've had this 13 Pro Max since released, I think about a year and a half ago now at this point. So I've been using it for about 18 months, and I've been using it very intensely. Like I drain the battery all the way down. I use it for video, for audio. I use it to surf the web. I use it for everything that you could imagine. And I'm terrible when it comes to making sure that the battery stays as full as possible in terms of having the best battery practices overall. So the one thing I will say is that from a hardware standpoint, everything is held up very true. I normally have this Pitaka case on it, or I rock it naked. I always have a screen protector on it. I have dropped it a couple times, so I have a couple nicks and scratches on the corners, but the screen is still intact. Everything still works perfectly fine. It has zero lag in terms of usability. The only thing that I will say is that my battery life has gone from 100% when I first got it all the way down to about 89% 18 months later in terms of maximum battery capacity. So this 13 Pro Max was definitely the battery champ, especially combined with iOS 15 because it was so optimized. I would get 2, sometimes 3 days of battery usage out of this 13 Pro Max. And now I usually end the day at around 15 to 10%, but I do use it very intensely. Like I mentioned, a lot of video recording, a lot of 4K recording, a lot of playback, a lot of audio, a lot of email, a lot of iMessage. So this thing is on a lot of the time. But like I mentioned, as long as you charge the battery correctly, take care of the battery life, and you always have a charge on it, then for the most part, the usability is exactly the same as the 14 Pro Max in terms of the fact that it doesn't slow down, all the games still work, the animations still work, it doesn't hiccup at all, it doesn't freeze. I've been very fortunate where this iPhone has been pretty much perfect overall. So at the end of the day, do I recommend you update from the 13 Pro Max to the 14 Pro Max? I don't really think so, and if you guys want to watch a video as to why I also think you shouldn't upgrade, it's because the iPhone 15 is pretty much around the corner with a lot more hardware upgrades that is going to future-proof you way further into the future, and I'll link that video down below. If you're just looking at the 13 Pro Max and the 14 Pro Max in a silo, unless you are that person that needs a 48 megapixel camera or that satellite connectivity, the SOS feature, and you know who you are, right? You're a professional photographer, you know that you can fully take advantage of that 48 megapixel raw footage, you know how to download that, you know how to move that to a certain computer, put it onto a certain program, certain software, and get it done, then by all means, you are that person that should upgrade from the 13 to to the 14. But for everybody else that just kind of is looking at the iPhone 14 and is getting a little bit of FOMO because of the dynamic island and things like that, then I would say hold off. It's really not worth the $1,100 upgrade unless you're absolutely dying to use the dynamic island. But I mark my words, after about a day or two of you using the dynamic island, it's going to disappear on the screen. You're going to completely forget about it, and you're going to wonder why you upgraded from the 13 to the 14. But that's going to do it for this video, everybody. Leave some comments down below of what you think, right? Are you a 13 Pro Max user? Did you hold off the upgrade to the 14? Or are you a 14 Pro Max user that upgraded maybe from a year or a 2-year-old phone, and so far you absolutely love it? I'm always down to discuss in the comments down below, because at the end of the day, buy whatever you want to buy whatever is going to make you happy. The iPhone 14 Pro Max, just by owning it, can bring enough value to somebody that it's worth owning. But now, if you're coming from an iPhone 6, 7, 8, or anything like that, upgrading to the 14 Pro Max is going to be an absolute game changer, everybody. But that's going to do it for this video. If you did make it to the end, leave a little dolphin in the comments down below so I know you made it to the end, and let me know in the comments down below. Are you Team 13 or Team 14? But that's going to do it. If you guys want to watch some more macOS, iPadOS, or iOS videos, click on one of these right here. But until next time, I'm Fernando, and I'm Team 13 Pro Max until the 15 comes out. Peace, everybody.